All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the to the second day, last session of the 2020 Big Data Conference at the Center of Mathematical Sciences and Applications. It's somewhat traditional in this conference that we always have as our closing speaker, at least to the greatest extent possible, a younger scholar who is something of a rising star. And so today we are thrilled to have Juan Camilo Castillo, who just finished his PhD in economics at Stanford, where he was a Kapnick Fellow. While there, he also spent some time at Microsoft Research, and he's joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania. He's written about, sort of everything from drug wars to Le Chatelier's principle, and today he's going to answer a question that all of us, I think, are like deeply excited about, in the market design and sort of applied data science communities, which is who benefits from surge pricing. I should tell you though, before I let him speak, let me add one personal note. So I mentioned he works on everything. It turns out another thing he's been working on is sort of international collaboration around vaccines and vaccine delivery, sort of in our moment, trying to expedite the sort of development and delivery of COVID-19 vaccines. And I've had the opportunity to work with him on a bit of this work, and I just have to say he's the most extraordinary scholar, and collaborator. The level of seriousness and depth with which he does all of this stuff is just off the charts. And so, it's my honor and pleasure to work with him and to be hosting him today. Let's welcome Camilo, who will tell us who benefits from surge pricing. Go for it.
Right. Thanks so much, Scott, for such a great introduction. And thanks so much to you and the rest of the organizers for the opportunity to present here. It really is great to present right next to such an amazing list of speakers. And thanks to everyone for being here and for staying until the very end. So I'm going to talk about this paper, Who Benefits from Surge Pricing. And as the title says, this is a paper about surge pricing in ride-hailing. Let me just say quickly that this is not an isolated case. This is part of a very big trend as more and more companies have started moving towards some form of dynamic pricing. But I'm just going to focus on this case of ride-hailing, which is probably the most prominent case. And there has been a lot of media attention. People have tended to emphasize that everyone hates surge pricing or that drivers are slaves to surge pricing. And this hasn't just been a debate in the media, it has actually had consequences on these markets. First, because of regulators. So some cities like New Delhi have decided to ban surge pricing. Some cities like New York have started considering doing surge pricing for taxis. And not only regulators, also companies themselves. We tend to think about Uber and Lyft that do surge pricing, but many companies around the world have themselves decided not to do surge pricing. And the most prominent example is probably Didi, which is the largest ride-hailing company in China. What this all points to is we need to have a good understanding of what are the effects surge pricing has on all market participants, and so far there hasn't been that much evidence. So that brings me directly to the main research question in this paper, which is who benefits from surge pricing? What do I do in order to answer this question? First, I build an empirical model of surge pricing by a monopolist platform, and it is composed of first, demand for trips, second, labor supply, and third, a matching technology that puts them both together. Then I estimate the model using data from Uber, and at the end, I use my model in order to measure the welfare effects surge pricing has on riders, drivers, and Uber. And to be very clear, what I mean by these welfare effects, I'm thinking about comparing surge pricing, the status quo, relative to a counterfactual in which there's just one single uniform multiplier that affects the whole market at all times of the week in all locations. This is a very quick summary of my findings. I find, first of all, that surge pricing increases total welfare by 1.6 of gross revenue, roughly 20 cents per trip. This is some evidence that surge pricing brings efficiency gains. But what's most interesting is that these effects are very asymmetric. Rider surplus increases by 5.25% of gross revenue, whereas driver surplus and Uber's profits decrease by 1.8 of gross revenue. Now, you might be wondering, why is Uber willing to do surge pricing if its profits decrease? So the point here is these are profits today. what Uber's probably doing is it's willing to give up a certain level of profits in order to have satisfied consumers who are going to come back to the platform, potentially giving it a higher long-run shareholder value. Now, why is it the fact that these effects are so asymmetric? There are three main reasons. They all go in the same direction. The first one is that search pricing saves time both from riders and riders, but these time savings are much more valuable for riders. The value of time for a driver is how much they earn per hour, which is basically minimum wages. For riders, you usually request a trip during time-sensitive moments because you have an appointment or because you want to get to the airport. So for that reason, the savings are more valuable on rider side. The second reason is that search pricing brings allocative efficiency gains as the market moves towards a price allocation mechanism. But they only benefit riders. Just because drivers' valuation for trips is homogeneous, it's just how much money they're going to get from that trip. And the third and final reason is I find that search pricing brings lower average prices. This is one of the main findings in a different work with Dan Knoffel and Glenn Weil. I'll talk more about it later, but the point is lower prices transfer welfare from drivers and Uber towards riders. Finally, you might be worried that the increases in rider surplus are actually at the expense of the surplus of low-income riders. I find that is not the case. In fact, all riders at all income levels benefit. Let me tie this. This is not a comprehensive literature review. Let me just tie this to two branches of literature. First, there are some other papers that look at the welfare effects of search pricing. How my paper is different is because of the fact, first of all, that it is empirical, and second, because I'm taking into account matching inefficiencies at the core of my model, and this is going to drive most of my findings. Also, there's a lot of literature about improving the design of search pricing, mostly from operations research and computer science, and my approach is very different. Instead of trying to see what's the optimal design, what I'll be looking at is taking as granted the design that Uber uses. What are the welfare effects this algorithm uses, this algorithm causes on different sides of the market? All right, so here's an outline of today's talk. First, I'll talk a bit about the data. I will show you some descriptive evidence. Then I'm going to move on to my model. I'm going to tell you how I estimate it, and I'm going to show you some results. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about the welfare effects of search pricing. So let me start talking about the data. I used data from Uber in Houston between March and April 2017. Now, one key feature of this time and period is that Lyft wasn't present. And this is good because it allows me to build my whole model without having to think at the same time about the effects of competition between different platforms. The main data that I see is data on trips, the time and coordinates when the trip was requested, when the rider was picked up and dropped off. I observe high frequency data on drivers, both their location and their state, as well as their earnings. And I also observe detailed high frequency data on riders, their location, the destination they chose, the fare and ETA they see in the app. And I'm able to back out riders' income by home census tract. The final piece of data is data on search multipliers. And so let me tell you quickly how prices work at Uber. The first thing is there's a base fare, which is just a function of how far you're going and how long Uber expects your trip to take. And the important part is this base fare does not vary in real time. The only part that varies in real time is the search multiplier, which multiplies this base fare. It responds to supply and demand conditions, and temporally it is updated every 2 minutes simultaneously across the whole city. I'm going to call each 2-minute period T. And spatially, it varies by these little hexagons you see here in this map. I'm going to call each one of these locations L. And I'm going to focus on this area in central Houston where most of the search pricing activity takes place. Okay, let me move on and show you some descriptive evidence. And the goal now is I want to show you what's the variation in the data that allows me to identify the key parameters of my model. Each one of these parameters is going to be related to one response margin by agents. So let me tell you what those margins are. First, in the long run, I want to see how people respond to changes in expectations, and this is going to affect people's entry decisions. In other words, how many riders and drivers open the app. I'm not going to focus on that today, and the reason is this ends up not being that important for my main results. I do a lot of robustness checks by changing these long run elasticities a lot, and in the end, what I find is that regardless of what value I plug in, my main qualitative findings hold. But let me just tell you that the main results I'll be showing today are based on some experimental measurements of elasticities. Some of these experiments have been run by Uber, and one of them was run by Angrist et al. In a different experiment they did to measure supply elasticities. The other key response margin, which is going to be the one I'm going to focus on, is in the short run, I want to see how people respond to deviations from expectations. And this is going to drive all decisions after having opened the app. So I want to see how riders and drivers respond to search multipliers, and I also want to see how riders respond to the ETAs that they observe in the app. So let me start talking about short run demand. And the question here is, we have some rider who already opened the app. How do the price and ETA that she observes affect the probability of requesting a trip? And basically the key challenge is that both prices and ETAs are endogenous. So I need to have an identification strategy for that. To measure the price response, I exploit the fact that there's rounding in the search pricing algorithm. So the algorithm first computes what they call a recommended multiplier, which is a continuous number. This number is then rounded to the nearest multiple of 0.1, and that's the actual multiplier that affects the market. So in this figure, I'm showing you in the horizontal axis residuals of prices, in the vertical axis residuals of dummies for whether people requested trips, and I am residualizing on the unrounded price. That means that these observations on the right are times when the search multiplier was rounded up. Those on the left are those in which the search multiplier was rounded down. And as you can see, there's a downward sloping trend. I'm basically exploiting the variation in prices that arises from this step of rounding, and just using that variation, I can see that there's a demand response as we would have expected. I also need to have an identification strategy to measure ETA responses. How do I do that? I'm only going to focus on variation within location by time period. Basically, I'm going to be comparing two riders who are in the exact same location and time period, and they get different ETAs just because of the random location of different drivers around them, and so relative to them. And in this figure, in the horizontal axis, I'm showing residuals of ETAs. In the vertical axis, again, dummies for whether people requested trips, and I'm residualizing on location by period fixed effects. And as you can see, the higher the ETA is, the less likely people are to request a trip, as we would have expected. So these two figures are showing you the main variation in the data I use to measure these demand responses. On the supply side, what I want to see is how do drivers' movements respond to search multipliers? And I'm going to do this in a very simple way for now. I'm going to split the space surrounding a driver. So we have a driver here. I'll split the space into these 6 location cones that you can see in this figure. And I'm going to regress dummies for whether the driver moves to each one of these locations or location cones on the average multiplier in each one of the 6 location cones. And the challenge is again that there's endogeneity. So I'm going to follow basically the same identification strategy as before. I'm going to control on the recommended multiplier, which means I'm only going to be using the variation that arises from rounding, and I get the results that you can see in this table. So what you can see is that all coefficients in the diagonal are positive and significant. Off diagonal coefficients are somewhat more noisy, but they tend to be negative. What does that mean? That if the search multiplier increases in one of these 6 location cones, drivers are more likely to go into that cone and less likely to go to the other 5 cones. So this is evidence that drivers tend to drift towards areas that have high search multipliers. All right, let me now move on to the main model I use to measure welfare. And let me give you a brief overview of everything that happens in the model. Every 2-minute period, what happens is at the beginning, there's a state of the market, which involves first the set of available drivers, and second, the set of busy drivers, each one of whom is going to drop off some passenger in some location in the future. And the first thing that happens is that some new riders and drivers arrive to the market. Then Uber monitors the state of the market. Based on that, it generates search multipliers, fares, and ETAs. Then riders decide whether they want to request a trip or leave the platform. Then those riders that requested a trip are matched to some nearby driver. Some of the drivers that were previously busy drop off their passenger. And then the drivers that are still available decide whether they want to leave the platform and if they decide to stay, they decide where they want to move. And after all of this, we have the state of the market by the beginning of the next period. As you can see, yeah.
Sorry, quick question. Does the arrival rate depend on rider expectations at all? So are they like sort of foreseeing what prices might be when they choose whether to show up, or only, or even if it's sort of exogenous, is there a higher arrival rate at times when prices are lower to be likely to be low?
So it does depend on expectations, but not. I basically assume when they decide whether to enter the platform, they don't know they don't make any inferences based on prices, but they do know that in equilibrium, this is a time both for riders, they know that in equilibrium, this is a time when they expect prices to be high or low. Same for drivers, they know that this is a time where they expect their earnings to be high.
Perfect, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot going on. I won't have time to talk about everything. I'm just going to focus on those steps that are in blue, which are the steps in which agents make decisions. Okay, so let me start talking about demand. There are two main decisions that riders make in this model. The first one is they decide whether they want to open the app or not. And after having opened the app, they decide whether they want to request a trip or not. So let me talk right now about the decision to open the app, and this kind of answers more in detail Scott's question. The arrival rate for every location and time period depends on two things. First, the location and the hour of the week, and second, the expected utility that this rider is going to get if she opens the app. And there's going to be a parameter that determines how responsive this person is. Basically, if this expected utility is higher, more people are going to arrive. And I'm going to set this parameter that measures responsiveness to match the experimental elasticity that we were previously measured of 0.63. Let me now focus on the decision to request a trip, which is where most of the action is. Suppose we have some rider I who is in some location L during some hour of the week H. This rider already opened the app and chose some destination and observed some fare P and some ETA W. Let X be a vector of rider covariates, which includes income, distance to the destination, and whether the trip is a weekend or an airport trip. And the question is, does this rider request a trip? And I'm only going to model the final choice for simplicity. Basically, the rider decides whether to request a trip or leave the platform. And I'm going to model this through this equation for utility. The utility she gets if she requests a trip is going to be first an intrinsic value of the trip, which is a function of the covariates and the location and the hour of the week. To that, I'm going to subtract this utility of paying, which is a coefficient times prices, and this utility of waiting, which is a coefficient times ETAs. And in the end, there's an error term. I allow both the price and ETA coefficients to vary with covariates, just because you don't expect different drivers to have the same elasticities. And this rider requests this trip if this utility is greater or equal to 0. How do I measure this model? So this is the same estimation equation I had in the previous slide. I'm just splitting the error term into two terms. The first one is a control function in which I control for the recommended multiplier and for average ETA by location and time period. I don't want to go through too many details, but once I control flexibly for these two things, I ensure that all the variation I use to identify the price and ETA coefficients are the sources of variation I talked about earlier, variation in prices from rounding and variation in ETAs within location and time period. And once I estimate this model, here are some, I'm just want to show you one figure showing you the main result from this model. And I'm showing you for different levels of income, how large is the value of time for each one of these riders. The value of time is just the ETA coefficient divided by the price coefficient. So how much money are you willing to give up to get one more minute? And as you can see, high income riders have higher value of time. You also have a higher value of time if you take a trip during a weekday than during the weekend. And you also have a higher value of time when you're going far away, especially if you're going to the airport. Now, the average value of time is pretty high. It's around $2.5 per minute. You should take into account that these are very valuable minutes. It's maybe 1 or 2 minutes that they are very valuable because they're making the difference between being in time, maybe for an appointment or maybe getting to the airport. And you should also take into account that many of these trips are requested not by one single rider, but by a group of 2 or 3 riders, all of who want to get to some destination in time. All right, let me now talk about the supply side. And there are three main decisions drivers make. First, they decide at the beginning of a shift whether they want to start working or not. And then every time they're available, they decide whether they want to keep on working. And if they decide to keep on working, they decide where they want to move. Now, one first approach would be to model these drivers as fully rational agents. And some previous papers about taxi markets have done that, but that won't be feasible in my setting just because there's a very high dimensional state space, because you would need to include all of the multipliers surrounding the driver when they make a decision. For that reason, I need to have a simpler model. The approach I follow is, in my model, I just predict drivers' behavior based on their expectations about earnings. And based on that predicted behavior, I can simulate how they behave to compute their earnings. Let me talk now about decisions 1 and 2 because they're pretty simple. How do they decide to start working or not? Very similar to the demand side, there's an arrival rate for every location and time period. It depends first on location and hour of the week, and second on how much they expect to earn. The more they expect to earn, the more drivers are going to arrive to that location. And I set the responsiveness to earnings so that it matches the experimental elasticity of 1.2 that Angrist et al. Obtained in their paper. How do drivers decide whether to keep on working or not? Very simple. The moment the driver arrives to the market, it draws a shift length from the empirical distribution, and as soon as this driver hits the end of this shift length, this driver is going to stop working. Let me now focus on the third decision of where to move, which is where most of the action in this part of the paper is. So we have some driver J who is in some location L at some time T. The question is, where will he be 2 minutes from now? And I'm going to make a big assumption. This is the main departure from full rationality, which is that this driver follows a stochastic movement rule. And let me tell you how it looks like. The driver, first of all, observes a map with all the multipliers in the city, which is something that the Uber app actually shows to drivers. And based on that map, the driver mentally turns it into the mean future earnings he's going to get if he decides to move to each one of these locations. So what is this? This is an average of the equilibrium behavior. So focus, for instance, on this location. The driver knows what happened to every single driver who moves in equilibrium into this location under similar circumstances. Some of these drivers end up moving north afterwards, some of them move south, some of them are matched immediately to a passenger, some of them need to wait a long time before being matched. After averaging all the earnings all of these drivers get, the driver computes the earnings for this particular location. And the movement rule depends first on mean future earnings in each one of these locations. And this is very important because even though these drivers are not fully rational, once they account for these mean future earnings, they're going to be behaving in a forward-looking manner. And the rule also depends on road and traffic patterns. Just because I don't want drivers to be able to jump instantaneously to the other side of the city, I don't want them to be able to jump across a river when there's no bridge, and I don't want them to be able to go too far away during rush hour when traffic is bad. There's going to be just one key parameter in this part of the model, which is going to measure how responsive drivers are to these mean future earnings. And just as on the demand side, I measured this from rounding in the search pricing algorithm, which provides me with a source of variation for these mean future earnings. All right, the third part of the model is matching. So the question here is, when some rider requests a trip, who among the nearby drivers is the one who picks her up? And I'm going to follow a procedure that's very similar to the way Uber was matching at the time. First, it predicts the pickup time from each one of the nearby drivers based on the coordinates of both the rider and the driver and the hour of the week. I implement this through a random forest. Then the trip is offered first to the nearest driver, who accepts it with some probability fee. If he doesn't accept it, it is then offered to the next nearest driver, who also accepts with probability fee. If not, it is offered to the next nearest driver, and so forth, until eventually one driver accepts it or no driver accepts it, and the rider doesn't get a trip. I'm going to, so this parameter phi is going to measure how well the matching takes place. If phi is high, you tend to be matched to someone who's close to you. If a lot of drivers decline trips, which is phi being low, you end up being matched to someone who's far away. So I set it at the value that is consistent with the average pickup time in the data. I do this through simulated method of moments. The final key part of the model is how an equilibrium looks like. I'm gonna skip it in the interest of time. Let me just tell you that the key idea is that agents' beliefs must be consistent with market averages. And I just ask you here to take a leap of faith, which is I do show that that an equilibrium exists, and furthermore, under certain conditions, there is a unique equilibrium. Let me move on to the welfare effects, which is kind of, I think, what we're all interested in. And what I'm gonna do from now on is I'm gonna start comparing a bunch of different scenarios, basically many different counterfactuals. And the difference between all these counterfactuals is that Uber is gonna be using different pricing policies in all of them. And let me check, is there a question? Oh no, okay. And the difference between all of these counterfactuals is that Uber uses different pricing policies. And I'm gonna compare these counterfactuals in these two axes. In the horizontal axis, I'm gonna show you the average multiplier. In the vertical axis, I'm gonna show you welfare. What I mean by welfare is the sum of rider surplus, driver surplus, and Uber's profits. And I'm gonna measure welfare relative to the status quo. So here, this dot over here is the status quo. The vertical dashed line is the average price in the data, 1.15 roughly. Let's think about first a couple of different search pricing policies where Uber uses the same search pricing algorithm, but it scales up all multipliers by a factor of 1.05 or scales it down by a factor of 0.95. Then we start moving to the right or to the left. We can, by doing that, we can trace out a whole curve of the different levels of welfare that can be achieved with search pricing with different levels of prices. We can do something very similar with a very different family of pricing policies in which Uber sets a uniform multiplier at different levels. And then we get this second curve over here. And the most important feature here to see is that search pricing dominates uniform pricing in the sense that for every level of the average multiplier, it is better to have search pricing than to have uniform pricing. Now, let me break down welfare into its components. The figure in the upper left is the same figure from the previous slide. The other three figures, I'm just breaking it down into its components. Let me note, first of all, that profits are increasing throughout this range. And what this means is that whatever Uber is doing here, it definitely isn't maximizing profits. I'm going to discuss this more later. And additionally, you should see that rider surplus is maximized exactly at the price level that I see in the data. Again, I'm going to come back to this later. Let me for now emphasize one very striking feature of this figure, which is basically all of the gap in total welfare, which basically this essentially means that there are efficiency gains that are brought to the market by search pricing. All of these efficiency gains go to riders because all of this gap can be accounted for by rider surplus. There's a tiny difference in driver surplus and profits, but it's basically all rider surplus. So why is it the case that riders get all of these efficiency gains? And in order to do that, I'm going to compare the status quo relative to a uniform multiplier at the same average price. So I'm going to measure the welfare effects of moving towards search pricing if the average price doesn't change. So, all right. I just saw a question, but I'll just tackle that at the end. And this figure on the left is decomposing all of the welfare effects on drivers and riders into two main sources. The first one is there's an increase in surplus from a better allocation of trips. That's just because if we move from uniform pricing, which basically allocates trips randomly when there are not enough drivers, towards search pricing, we end up allocating trips to the high willingness to pay people. That leads to an increase in rider surplus, which is this orange bar over here. The equivalent bar for drivers is identically equal to 0. And the reason is that basically drivers' value for trips is the same for every driver. If you think about two drivers who could have been matched to one particular rider who requested a trip, they both get the same value from the trip, just how much money they earn. So there's no efficiency gain we can obtain by swapping them. The second source of efficiency gains is the fact that search pricing saves people's time. If you're a rider, you need to wait less time before being picked up. If you're a driver, you need to wait less time between two different trips. So in this figure on the right, you can see that actually drivers save more time. But once we translate them into surplus changes, we can see that riders have a higher value of these time savings are more valuable. That's because drivers' value of time is minimum wages. Riders' value of time is much higher. As I told you, it's $2.5 per minute. So this ends up being a higher saving for riders. Now, once we put this together and kind of draw one full picture of the welfare effects, in this figure, I'm showing you changes in total welfare, rider surplus, driver surplus, and profits. And I'm comparing different scenarios. The black one is the status quo or surge pricing. So I'm measuring everything relative to that. The blue one is uniform pricing with the same average multiplier. And the welfare effect from surge pricing is if we move from the blue line towards the black line, there's an increase in total welfare, most of which is accounted for by the increase in rider surplus. But of course, if a regulator told Uber, you cannot do surge pricing, you wouldn't expect Uber to set prices at the same level from the status quo. It would for sure re-optimize prices and set them at a different level. So let me try to see where that would happen. The question is, at which price level would Uber set that uniform multiplier? Let me go back to the figure on the rider surplus I showed you a couple of slides ago. I showed you that rider surplus is maximized at the price level I see in the data. So this might be surprising. Why is Uber maximizing this instead of profits? Well, the answer is probably that Uber doesn't want to maximize profits today. In fact, if you look at Uber's statements, you would see that it's actually losing money. What Uber wants to maximize is long-run shareholder value. And if Uber thinks that the main driver of this shareholder value are current riders' profits, basically consumer satisfaction, so that they come back to the platform in the future, this wouldn't be that surprising. I'm going to assume that if Uber is forced to set a uniform multiplier, it's going to set it at the level that maximizes that maximizes rider surplus, and this is the level that I get. Now, I do some robustness on this. I try to see other potential ways that can justify the level of prices that they currently have. Regardless of what I choose, the optimal level of the uniform multiplier is going to be very similar to 1.25, which is basically what we see here. And why is it the case that this level of prices is higher? This is one of the key findings from my paper I mentioned at the beginning with Dan Knuffel and Glenn Weil. The key point is that there's a big matching failure that takes place in this market whenever demand is very high relative to supply. And it's very easy to avoid with surge pricing, which automatically avoids this kind of situation. With uniform pricing, the only way to avoid it is by setting one single uniform multiplier at all times. So that's what explains this. But the main point is, if we go from uniform pricing towards surge pricing, we decrease prices, and we therefore transfer welfare from drivers and Uber towards riders. So let's revisit the figure I showed you before. Now, let's take into account the fact that Uber is going to re-optimize and set a different level of prices. And what we see is this new figure over here, this red line. This is the level of welfare with the optimal uniform multiplier. And on rider surplus, we basically don't see a big change. But on driver surplus, what we see is that since there's a decrease in prices, driver surplus ends up being lower with surge pricing, and Uber's profits also go down. So this, going from the red figure to the black figure, is the main welfare result I emphasized since the introduction. There's an increase in rider surplus, but there is a net decrease in driver surplus and in Uber's profits. Now, one final thing you might be worried about is maybe there's an increase in rider surplus overall, but maybe what surge pricing is doing is it's hurting low-income riders. Let me show you that is not the case. On this figure, I'm again comparing different scenarios. Surge pricing is the black dotted line. Uniform pricing is the blue dashed line. So if we move from uniform pricing towards surge pricing, we see, and this is having this without changing the average level of the multiplier, we see that there's an increase in every single level of income, rider surplus increases. But it especially increases for high income riders, as you might have expected. Now, once we take into account price effects, there's one key point, which is low income riders like low prices. That's because they're price sensitive. High income riders prefer high prices because they prefer, these high prices are gonna skim low income riders, And that's going to increase the quality of service, which has a high value for them. So what this means in the end is once we put together all of the welfare effects from search pricing, we see that low-income riders benefit the most as we move from the red line towards the black line. And high-income riders, the highest income riders, are actually roughly indifferent between search pricing and uniform pricing. All right, let me just wrap up. And as I told you in this paper, I find that search pricing leads to efficiency gains, but not everyone is better off. Riders benefit, drivers are hurt, and profits go down, although I wouldn't claim that this means that Uber is worse off, because it might just be happy to have this big increase in rider surplus. Now, let me tie this back to the introduction. I talked about many complaints people have made about search pricing. Are those complaints well-founded? I would say they are not on rider side, maybe because they're not considering equilibrium effects, which my model is taking into account. On driver side, I would say it is potentially well justified to have these complaints. I do observe a small effect on driver surplus, but it might be important relative to the low earnings drivers get in this market. All right, that's basically it. I'll be happy to take any questions. So I think there was a question, right?
Yeah, I think there's a question in the Q&A, and then I have one, and then others, if you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A bin or in the chat. Question in the Q&A is, Rod Siraj asks, I'm thinking that the data is not complete. For example, Karura excludes rides information.
Well, I guess I would have to read what the link is saying, but what exactly? I mean, Rod, if you can.
Yeah, Rod, could you give a little bit more information about what you're wondering about here? Like, what's the incompleteness you're thinking about? Maybe while we're waiting for him. He says, going off Uber visibility. So the question is, when a driver like disappears or sort of, might be sort of in supply, but not like actively in supply or something like that?
Well, I mean, yeah, of course, like these drivers can log off and log on at will. Basically, like taking these short periods, I'm taking them as this driver basically just, I don't know, if it's less than 5 minutes, I take this as the driver never left the platform. If the time that they go away is longer, I just take this as the driver is maybe taking a break. And I agree that might be some issue doing the ride, but without letting, oh, I see what you mean. I mean, I guess it's hard to answer. This question is hard to answer. If you ask Uber people, they don't think that drivers do this more than a couple, like 1 or 2% of the time. But yeah, I agree that it's a big issue that could complicate things.
Yeah, I think like especially with safety concerns, both on the driver's side and the rider's side, there's like a pretty strong disincentive to go offline unless you already know the driver and have a sort of pre-established sort of structure and deal. Okay, cool. So this was totally awesome. I'm wondering, so given the like huge wedge that's going to the consumers, I wonder whether you have a view on sort of downstream, sort of 5-10 years, or assuming rideshare makes it that long, like 5 to 10 years from now, like how the platform might change its pricing structure. If we think right now they're building up consumer sort of engagement and welfare, is that that might not be the optimal corporate strategy 5 years out. So what would we say instead?
So one very simple answer is, one thing Uber would be doing initially is they would start increasing prices. Mm-hmm. So that's one very short answer I can give you. They would start increasing prices, which is actually better also for welfare, because as I showed you,
right,
welfare maximizing prices are higher. That's one thing. Whether they would stop doing stop doing search pricing, maybe what they would do is do search pricing, but at higher levels of prices, and that would still be better for them.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. It's super cool, by the way. I mean, like I've never really sort of grokked as clearly as now how much it's about the welfare is being driven by who has the strong preferences in this market, which of course is like super intuitive from an economic perspective ex post, but like I didn't like register that was the underlying feature.
And connected to that, like It's all one thing. It's absolutely true what you're saying, but it's also all related to who values the most, like getting rid of the matching inefficiency, basically.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like, you know, heterogeneity and strength of weight on that heterogeneity term. Yeah. Awesome. Deepak asks, why did you discretize the area hexagonally?
Okay, so first of all, like these hexagons are pretty small. I mean, trying to do this even smaller, that would that would hit the limits of what I can do computationally. And why hexagonally? Those are the hexagons that Uber uses. That's the level at which Uber sets search multipliers. So I basically use the same level at which they do it.
Nice. And that feeds very nicely into Viksha Madhu's question. How did you collect the data, and do these companies make their data public?
So no, they don't. I got in touch with them for to do this for a different project. Once I was inside kind of the system, I kind of suggested them that I would want to do this project. They're kind of to explain to you how the whole process basically works at Uber. They have an initial phase in which you give them a research proposal and they basically approve it or not. Once they approve that research proposal, they let you publish regardless of what's the outcome of your paper. And of course, they won't let the data be public, but if someone wanted to replicate what I'm doing, Uber would allow someone to move into their offices and start replicating the paper. That's kind of their data policy.
Nice.
That basically as far as they can push it, given that they have a legal department that won't let them be more open than they currently are.
Nice. That's still like a very large amount of flexibility. That's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any further questions? Going once. Going twice. All right. Sold. Let's all thank Camilo. Thank you so much. Throw thanks in the chat as we introduced yesterday. And then that was totally awesome. Let me and indeed the that was totally awesome. I will extend to the whole event. Let me thank all of you for attending and all of the speakers and co-organizers. Thank you to the staff. Ryan and is Elena here? You two juggled all of this and juggled, sort of, many changes in situation and structure as we were setting up this conference. It's been really wonderful to have Big Data 2020 be worldwide. I have to admit, I was like really skeptical ex ante about the virtual format, but I've been super impressed. The talks have been fantastic. The audience has been fantastic, and we've been able to reach people all over. I mean, I've been seeing names and LinkedIn profiles flow through from all around the world. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you in 2021. And I do not know what format it will be in yet, possibly even a hybrid with some in person and some virtual if we're lucky. In any event, thanks and QED.